Excuse me while I just disappear from view here for 1 second. Oh, good morning. Good morning. As you heard, this is a year in the life of the Better Docs project. And this is a little more intimidating than I expected it to be, because so many of you are writers, and I'm an engineer that writes her own docs. You're all very eloquent, and I don't necessarily feel as eloquent as you are, so hopefully that doesn't come through. Ironically, though, I managed to snag technical.inc for my domain name, which I feel is super appropriate for Write the Docs. So, hi, I'm Rowan, and I work at BuzzFeed as a site reliability engineer. Since documentation is a story about our technology, I thought I'd tell you a story about our documenteers at BuzzFeed. And that starts with a story about me. I like to talk about myself. Chapter 0, learning to be a communicator. Because engineers are really just communicators. Code is language like anything else. I became an engineer in a non-traditional way, as if there is such a thing as a traditional path to engineering. I spent over a decade after leaving high school in a variety of jobs. I was a customer service agent, I worked in a movie theater, I did childcare, and as was mentioned in the introduction, I got into analog game design. This taught me how important clear and concise documentation can be. Each of these jobs relies on some sort of documentation for instruction, for context, or in game design to even be able to participate. I won an award for a game, and the rules aren't terribly clear, and I was a little bit embarrassed about getting an award for it. So I started to think very hard about what makes good documentation. It was important to me to be able to communicate with people, not just how to play my game, but what the game is about and why it matters. Sometimes I pull out role-playing game books and I compare them to engineering books. I wonder if Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't be a better game if someone handed it off to a technical writer to polish. So much confusion, so many flipping back and forth from pages. It needs to be better. After about a decade of various careers, I had a life crisis that made low-wage work not possible for me anymore. The engine literally fell out of my car in a parking lot. I came outside, and my car had no engine. I went home and I cried, because that's what you do. And while I was there, a friend of mine asked me if I'd ever considered engineering. I told her a big, sad story, and if you want to hear it, grab me after this. It's all about how I was told I'm terrible at math and can't program computers. And my friend said, engineering's not math. It's problem solving and logic. So here, try this tutorial. Tell me what you think. I got into a boot camp after trying the tutorial and loving it. And after a year there, I can confidently say almost everything I know about how technology works, I learned through documentation. Not because my instructors were bad, it's the opposite. They were great. They wanted us to learn exactly how people in the industry learn. So when we ran into trouble, they helped us find documentation, search through it for the answers, and when necessary, reach out to ask for corrections or clarifications. That taught me the importance of documentation to technology. Not just because it's how engineers communicate with each other, because it's how we communicate with our users, our stakeholders, people we've never met. At boot camp, as we worked, we were encouraged to keep code journals and notes, and over time, those became the beginnings of documents for our code. I cringe looking back at a lot of that stuff now. I've hidden it all in a private Bitbucket so that none of you can see how bad my communication skills were. But at the same time, it's exciting to look back and to see the story of my journey reflected in the things I've learned and the things I found important. I was able to communicate not just the outcome of my code, but why that outcome happened and what it meant. Finally, I graduated, and I got hired at BuzzFeed, and I had to onboard. Onboarding was a nightmare. Chapter 1. We have so many docs, we don't know what we've documented. How do you find a needle in a haystack made of needles? The answer is magnets, by the way. So yeah, I'm at this new job, and I'm onboarding, and I'm reading all of these docs. I'm reading docs off GitHub, which is why Mona is on this slide, poorly drawn. I'm reading docs in Jira. I'm reading docs in wikis. I'm reading docs in Google Drive. I'm reading docs in systems I've never seen before and will never look at again, like Confluence. Sometimes I would read the same doc in 3 different locations, and 3 different people would swear to me that those docs were unique. They weren't. It meant reading volumes of documentation. Onboarding, I probably spent my first 3 weeks doing nothing but reading. And half the time I would finish a doc, only to find out the latest revision was kept somewhere else, or even incomplete. Feature development would mean that a dev would get halfway into writing a doc and then there'd be a deadline. They didn't have time to finish before the next feature called. Another complicating factor is that BuzzFeed has tech teams scattered across many time zones and around the globe. Just in the United States, we have offices in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and New York. In addition, we have a tech team in London. We have a number of remote people scattered across Europe, and there's a small embedded team, I think, in Japan, although it might only be 1 engineer. Because of this, we had to coordinate across so many groups, and it included crossing technologies. Our Minneapolis office is primarily mobile development, and they keep their documentation in a completely different style. Some of our API developers had automated doc generation. Others chose to painstakingly write their docs by hand. There was Markdown, there was rich text, there was web pages. Sometimes I started to think the problem-solving skills that made me a good engineer were going to be applied my entire career to how to find the document I needed. It was maddening. But somehow, I managed to onboard. I made notes for myself where things could be deduplicated. I submitted issues when documentation was incomplete. And where possible, I tried to help by contributing more information through my experience of working with the systems. And then the next hurdle came. Oh, that was too early, I'm sorry. When I finished onboarding and I settled in, it was time for me to become responsible for the system as any site reliability engineer ultimately is. It was time to go on call and get my pager, in this case, pager duty, And I remember feeling panicky about it. Not just because I would be responsible for the well-being of the systems or services, but because we didn't have run books collected in a single place. One of my biggest fears about going on call was that the disarray was going to lead to me being paged at 3 o'clock in the morning and having no idea what to do. At BuzzFeed, service owners own their services. Site reliability owns infrastructure. But right now, SRE is the only discipline that gets paged when something goes down. When I mentioned my concern to one of my teammates, his response was, "We don't have a standard run book, we don't have a standard location, and just like the other docs, it's the luck of the draw if you can find it." He said, "We're responsible for rescuing services we didn't write or deploy," and I thought, and too often we're doing it in the dark, both literally, 3 a.m., and metaphorically, with no guidance. I watched my teammate's face fall a little bit as he mentioned this, but then he smiled and he said, "I've heard of a group at BuzzFeed that's tackling this documentation problem." And he forwarded me the announcement the Better Docs project had recently sent out. Now it's time for the new slide. Chapter 2. When people who care get together, they can do anything. A group that can order a pizza is a group that can improve docs. Someone once told me, if you get a group of people together and they can collaborate to order a pizza without killing each other, they could collaborate to take over the world. That stuck with me. I like food metaphors because people instinctually understand food. We've all been in a pizza fight, right? We've all had to argue for our topping and against someone else's. While the Better Docs project didn't order pizzas, we did kind of take over the world. At least we took over shaping and organizing the world's documentation. Basically the same thing, right? If you describe it, you're in charge of it. I went to my first meeting of this group, the Better Docs project, and I was tentative and a bit nervous. After all, for many engineers, documentation can be a very touchy subject, and at BuzzFeed, all the engineers write their own docs. Thinking back to how first day of class style nervous I was, it's kind of funny now. The members of the Better Docs project represented many kinds of documentation users at BuzzFeed, not just writers. And that's my first key takeaway. Your documentation, ultimately, is for people who will use it, so include them in your documentation process. The group was a truly cooperative and collaborative group. And when I joined, the first task they had come to consensus on was creating a standard for README files, which are the basis of any service at BuzzFeed. All right, I gotta be fair. We have one class of service that doesn't require a README. Its sole job is to consume other services, and I still think not requiring a README may be a mistake on our part. I really like docs. I want to document everything. As we started to find success in creating a standardized template, we realized that as a group, we could probably establish standards for all of our documentation. I, of course, wanted to get started on runbooks, but in the name of compromise, I agreed to prioritize some of the other kinds of docs. Things like pull request templates, and postmortem reports. these are also documentation. Over the first summer, we made great headway within the group, but we wanted to find a way to make a bigger impact and to invite the tech community at BuzzFeed to join us in our efforts and our passion. We brainstormed a few things, but nothing caught on right away, until our summer hack week. At BuzzFeed, we have a hack week in the summer. Everyone in the tech org sets down their feature work, their product work, their maintenance work. SREs might still get paged, but otherwise, we take a week and we work on something we're excited about, something fun or new, or that we've always wanted to learn, or maybe even something that we've wanted to teach. My Hack Week project my first year at BuzzFeed was a Slack bot called DocBot. Her job? Responding to your queries about services by serving up their related documentation. As a Hack Week project, the team I worked with didn't have a lot of time, and so we hard-coded in many of the links, which reminded me that querying our docs was still too difficult because of the scattered nature of where they were located. We couldn't issue programmatic calls. We had to force strings for URLs. After Hack Week, though, two amazing things happened. First, another member of the Better Docs project asked if she could take over developing DocBot with her mentee, and I, of course, said yes. DocBot became a fully fledged Python web application rather than a set of slash commands with links embedded in them. Over 6 months, these two amazing women, Ola and Larissa, took the proof of concept bot and turned it into the beginning of an automated documentation librarian. What was the second thing? The Better Docs project asked ourselves, what if we threw a documentation day? Like Hack Week, but for docs. And yeah, it turns out that's a lot like Write the Docs Right Day. It was really comfortable for me being there after doing Doc Day. Oh, I have a note. I'm supposed to make a joke about how engineers like to bike shed the wheel. I wrote that at like 3 a.m. Cool. We tried to think of when a good time to do a doc day might be, and our first thought was the holidays. We're already setting aside feature work, but then we realized most of the office was gonna be gone. So we started talking about after the holidays. What better way to re-meet your work after taking some time away from it than by writing about it? So we picked a day in mid-January. We tried to think of what might motivate folks to join Doc Day. It wasn't mandatory, so we had to come up with some incentives. There were stickers and food, and we decided to track how many README files we could get up to the new standard and to make some sort of achievement out of it. We wondered if, being BuzzFeed, we could relate it to a meme, and then inspiration struck. Inspired by Beyonce, we began advertising Doc Day with signs that said, if you love it, you should document it. And if there's anything you can count on every BuzzFeeder to agree on, it's that you don't deny the rallying cry of Beyonce. So in mid-January, just after the holidays during a lovely snow shower, we threw a Doc Day, coordinated across 4 big offices, as well as including as many of our remote tech folks as we could. We threw a party, the theme of which was Great Docs. And we promised that if we could get from our starting point, just under 30% compliant, to over 50% standardized README files, we'd release a custom Slack emoji. because emoji are like stickers for Slack, and it's pretty clear by now we're all a bunch of adults who'll do just about anything for a sticker. We made over 70% standardized READMEs in one day. Chapter 3, and you can too. Doc improvement isn't magic, it's just continuously telling the story of your work. In debriefing after Doc Day, we found some aspects of our initiatives that had been crucial and that could form the basis of a framework for documentation improvement. We identified that having the whole community involved in documenting, especially those engineers and support folks who had the least confidence in their skills, was what put us over the top. We asked around and found out about documentation relays, where someone would start a doc and then hand it off and start the next one. We found out about intra-team competitions and support. And we learned that a lot of people are motivated by doing something good. So what worked? Our biggest realization was definitely that it mattered that everyone on the Better Docs project cared intensely about improving the state of documentation at BuzzFeed. To quote the old commercial, we weren't just supervising docs, we were members of the doc-using community. We had each come because some aspect of documentation at BuzzFeed was painful to us, our teams, or maybe just our friends. We also realized that each of us had, in our own way, been advocates and cheerleaders for the initiative and for the idea that documentation could be fun and useful, whether it was by sharing with our teams or by encouraging folks to contribute to documentation in small ways. We could make progress. We supported, and yes, occasionally even tricked folks into documenting, only for them to discover that documentary friction was reduced when docs were considered part of the continuous delivery process, and that docs could be fun instead of chore-like. The first key to success, then, is finding the people in your organization who genuinely understand that docs matter and who are improvement-minded and eager to bring new ideas and new eyes to documentation. Ask new members of your organization for their feedback and ideas, and then invite them to contribute them to the docs directly. Subtly getting buy-in seems to be much more effective than top-down pressure. We'd constructed Doc Day to be a community event, but we also found that some of what made the day and the project successful was emphasizing smaller, individual achievements. One person undertook to organize the Google Drive folder for their team, and in the process, they cleared out duplicate docs and consolidated others in ways that made sense. We made sure to highlight that, both at the event and at the debrief, and we weren't terribly surprised when that engineer started coming to meetings. We made the custom Slack emoji a thing of celebration. If you remember Jim's talk yesterday, shame makes people feel bad and they don't want to engage. It doesn't inspire creative work. When documentation gets updated, we try to remember to use the emoji to celebrate. And on more than one occasion, I've seen it used to thank someone for a doc's contribution they thought would go unnoticed. You should find some small but regular way to note the contributions and achievements on documentation. It's not just about the green blocks on GitHub. Especially if you're trying to encourage engineers or support folks to participate, because too often the recognition they get is when a feature releases or fails to release, and people want to know why. If you recognize docs in the same way you recognize code, you bring the two sorts of accomplishments together in people's minds. And that starts bringing documentation at least in a basic way, into the development cycle. Okay, I fibbed a little bit earlier. We did make one top-down change. We began including documentation templates in our pull request templates. We did this to create the expectation that new code should be examined to see if it needs new docs. If it does, those docs should be in the pull request. One of the biggest drags we saw was that if people put off writing their documentation, they just never quite finished. Continuous is a big buzzword in tech right now, but it's a good one. Using the fact that continuous motion propels itself, integrating docs right into pull requests and feature development creates that same kind of momentum. And make sure you're taking time to celebrate that momentum and the docs that are created. Celebration is a huge part of BuzzFeed culture. It's definitely the flip side of the fact that we work hard. Pizza parties or fancy cakes are one way to celebrate. T-shirts are another. But even just a few different stickers as earnables is a pretty good start. Oh, hey, my note says breathe, I'm almost there. I documented this whole talk, see? Oh yeah, there's one more thing we debuted at Doc Day. When I was first onboarding, the most memorable piece of BuzzFeed documentation I saw was an architecture diagram created in our yearly PEEP diorama contest. PEEPs are a kind of marshmallow candy if you've never celebrated Easter in a place that has them. Different PEEPs were linked together by red licorice whips to show how they connected. This diagram, though it's less accurate these days now that we've moved into the cloud with microservices, has stuck with me because it was highly visual and memorable. So working together with a member of the design team, we created architecture monsters. Little characters to represent various aspects of our architecture, from load balancers and databases to clients that might consume our site, such as mobile browsers. There are 14 of them in all. Since we introduced them, these monsters have found their way into diagrams, proposals, and even the occasional email. Sooner or later, I expect to find them on a t-shirt to celebrate docs, or perhaps printed out in life-size cutout, just hanging around the office, like our giant standee of Ryan Gosling. It's creepy. You come around the corner and he's waiting for you. While you might not have a design team to call on for flourishes like this, finding ways to add small personalizations to your documentation can make the difference between it feeling like a painful grind or a reasonably pleasant part of your day. No one wants to look at stuff that's upsetting. Make it fun. So, if you can take anything from the BuzzFeed Better Docs project, I offer you this. 1, get a group of folks who care about documentation and ask them to champion it to others. 2, find ways to make documentation fun and reduce the sense of obligation that goes with it. 3, involve everyone, especially the folks who think they're not good documentarians. Their eyes are fresher, and they'll find things you've missed. I've lost count, but keep it regular. Don't make documenting something that only happens once a quarter or once a year. Celebrate your wins instead of shaming your failures. And remember, if you love it, you should document it. I'd like to thank the Better Docs project at BuzzFeed for showing me that documentation could be amazing. And real briefly, I'm going to give a shout out to my partner who listened to me tear my hair out last night as I revised this talk. Thank you.